The inspector's final speech is a speech that will go in every single essay you ever write because ultimately it is Priestley's main words. Now, Priestley, interestingly, before he wrote this play, had a socialist radio programme on the BBC, and that radio programme itself was cancelled because it was too radical. And these words that the inspector says are really the words of Priestley. And that's what I want you to think about when we analyse it together. So, first things first, we need to picture the inspector as a really omnipotent, almost supernatural being. He seems to know everything, he's omniscient, he seems to be able to overcome every character in the play. And he says many things that we need to take into consideration. The first thing he says is that there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths, okay? And one Eva Smith is dead, yeah? But there are millions and millions of these dehumanized and objectified members of the proletariat. And the millions and millions tells us that this amount of suffering is excessive. There is a many to it. There is a lot, an excessive and unnecessary amount of injustice. There's millions of it, and it is caused by misanthropy, selfishness, sin, etc. And if there are millions and millions of people like Eva Smith, millions of people within the proletariat, then there are so many who, under the Edwardian social hierarchy, have been oppressed and dehumanized. There is a mass amount of oppression and dehumanization. And by telling us just how much there is, he wants the Burlings to feel the guilt of just how many have suffered in this chain of events because of this wall that has been built between classes. And it's not just the Burlings he wants to feel this guilt, but the audience too, to understand that what structures in society create this injustice. And he wants us to be afraid of going back to that time, because lots of social progress has happened since to 1945. Yeah, the Labour Party have come into power in 1945, creating a more collectivist approach. We've had people coming together, we've had women in the workforce. There's been a lot of social and political change. So he wants us to fear social and political regression, going backwards. Because if we go backwards, we'll go backwards to this, to millions and millions and millions of suffering. And he also says, we do not live alone. We are all members of one body. And I've not written that quote down, but it's really useful to kind of embed within your essay, because there's lots of things we can talk about, the idea of the body, of all of the organs within a body being useful and all of the people being needed to keep that one body of a community running. We have the idea of the physical body, and Eva Smith's body on a slab, and what will happen to the body if it is punished and oppressed and made to suffer. It will die. And also we have the idea of the body of Christ and how a body is God-given and that it should be protected and cared for. And the body of Eva Smith and the millions and millions and millions is not being cared for. So there's loads of things we can talk about with the idea of a body, but it's really that humanizing of people and the idea that we need everyone, the idea of collective responsibility. And ultimately, this play, it intends to teach a lesson. It is entirely instructive and didactic. And the inspector, and by proxy Priestley, says, if men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. And I love this quote specifically because each image is so juicy, there's so much to say, but also because it is his main message, so we can refer to it time and time again. The idea of what we have to learn throughout this play. And we've seen the younger generation, if they don't learn, they will just mirror what they've been taught already. So we have to make sure they learn the right lesson. And if they don't learn it, they'll be taught it in fire. Well, we know that when we see fire, it's a severe punishment, isn't it? When we see fire, we think of hell, of damnation. We think of sin. The sins of the bourgeoisie, they will be punished in the afterlife eternally for their sins. It also makes us see this inspector as this almost godlike, above the clouds, omnipotent force, and it makes this punishment inevitable. If we sin, if we continue this chain of events, if we don't break it and atone, like Scrooge, for example, then we will be inevitably damned. And then the blood, well, it makes us think of violence. And if we think about the time period of this play, we've just lived through 2 world wars. And this violence is just around the corner for the people in this play. This play is set in 1912, and the war started, World War I, in 1914. So it's foreshadowing the violence of war. But this blood that will inevitably come to the Burlings in this play, the blood of World War I, the audience knows that that was inevitable. So it tells us that violence is inevitable. That suffering itself is inevitable if we continue, if we don't learn our lesson. And then it ends on anguish. And anguish does happen. This idea of inevitable punishment, it does happen. We have the sharp ring at the end of the play, and we have the fact that they will be trapped in this cycle of suffering because the telephone goes off, and again they're going to be questioned by an inspector. The whole events of the play start again, almost to represent this inevitable cycle of suffering that we cannot get out of unless we learn that lesson. So the inspector's final speech is so filled with the main ideas of the play that it's the one that I would practice the most. I would practice this paragraph the most. And in terms of the lesson that Priestley wants us to learn, I would come back to these big ideas about how we need to disrupt, dismantle, and destabilize the wall between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, to cut into and sharply disrupt the social hierarchy and the wall that has been built to between classes that creates social injustice. And that is the lesson that some characters in this play do learn, but mainly the rest of society and the audience need to learn, because there will always be people who do not learn that lesson. And if we allow those people to be powerful and to lead, they will teach their children that lesson, and society will never change. It will continue this chain of events that will maintain the suffering of the millions.